Welcome to the debate. Today, we are deep diving into one of the fiercest and I'd say most persistent controversies within conservation science. It's all about how we define, how we treat, and frankly, how we talk about non-native species. But the core of this debate, really, it moves beyond just the ecology. It actually revolves around the legitimacy of scientific dissent itself.
That's exactly right. We're looking closely at some highly charged publications that have come out over the last decade or so. These explicitly label critics of invasion biology as practicing invasive species denialism, or ISD. And this isn't just a casual disagreement, is it? This debate has been, formalized in major journals. Think Trends in Ecology and Evolution, with proponents like James C. Russell and Tim M. Blackburn. And then, of course, it's been vigorously challenged by scholars such as David M. Frank and Mark A. Davis.
Right. And the central argument from, let's call them the ISD proponents, is essentially that the scientific consensus on the danger posed by specifically high-impact introduced species is just so strong. Overwhelming, really. So strong that organized critique against it starts to look like, well, typical anti-science denialist campaigns, and crucially, that it hinders necessary policy.
So our central question today, I suppose, boils down to this. Is this strong, often values-based critique of invasion biology accurately categorized and maybe dismissed as a harmful denialism? Or is it actually, a legitimate, perhaps even necessary scientific and ethical disagreement, one that challenges the field's fundamental and, let's be honest, often subjective normative judgments?
My position here is quite firm. We really must recognize denialism as a genuine threat in this space. ISD, I believe, is a real phenomenon. It employs non-epistemic tactics specifically to mislead the public and ultimately impede necessary conservation action against what are truly global biodiversity threats. The stakes are just too high for ambiguity.
And I'm going to argue that the denialism label is itself the threat here, that it's essentially a prejudicial rhetorical tactic, one used perhaps sometimes unintentionally, but used nonetheless to shut down valid scientific and, importantly, values-based critiques. And these critiques, I'd say, are absolutely essential for progress in any science that is so fundamentally built on value judgments, which conservation biology clearly is.
Okay, but let's look at the scientific foundation for a moment. The consensus on the negative impacts of invasive alien species, IAS, it really is overwhelming. I mean, they consistently rank among the major drivers of biodiversity loss globally. And critically, organizations like the IUCN, they define an IAS explicitly by its negative impact. It's part of the definition.
Yeah, I see why you start there. But that, for me, is precisely where the issue begins. The definition itself is fundamentally value-laden, isn't it? The whole field of invasion biology seems to presuppose that the origin of a species, its nativeness, is the most relevant ethical and scientific criterion for deciding how to manage it, almost regardless of its actual function in an ecosystem today.
But don't critics of the field often move beyond that kind of legitimate disagreement over values? I mean, when scientific uncertainty is deliberately magnified, or, evidence is cherry-picked specifically to confuse the public or policymakers, surely we enter the realm of what philosophers of science sometimes call normatively inappropriate dissent. Meaning, the dissent isn't really based on good scientific practice anymore, it's motivated by a different agenda, often one aimed at blocking policy. And that tendency is what leads to the denialism label being applied.
Well, that's a very powerful charge, and it's one that definitely requires careful scrutiny. I'd counter, though, with some empirical data. There was a key reevaluation study, you might know it, that examined 75 scholarly articles cited as examples of ISD. And what did the authors find was the primary source of disagreement in those papers? It wasn't, generally speaking, the refutation of scientific facts. Actually, only a tiny fraction, maybe 5 out of 75, showed text really consistent with the formal criteria for science denialism.
Okay, so if it wasn't denial of scientific fact, what was the disagreement primarily about then?
It was mostly disagreement over the values underpinning the science and its application. The critique in the vast majority of cases is aimed squarely at that ethical leap you have to take to get from a scientific observation like a species is here to a policy prescription, therefore we ought to eradicate it. The disagreement on these, well, quite subjective concepts like what constitutes acceptable harm or what is a desirable ecosystem composition. These are disagreements about ethical judgments, not necessarily scientific shortcomings. And labeling this legitimate discourse denialism, I think, is an inappropriate rhetorical move. It risks eroding public trust by making any disagreement look illegitimate.
But that risk assessment, it has to be weighed against the potential harm of an action. Critics like Anthony Ricciardi and Randy Ryan, they point out that in surveys, something like 68% of invasion biologists agree there's strong evidence for IAS causing native species decline. Now, that suggests a pretty solid core scientific consensus that, well, some critics seem to be working quite hard to destabilize, maybe for political or ethical reasons rather than purely scientific ones.
But that consensus you mention, it's usually about the existence of those high-impact invaders, right? Which frankly no serious scholar actually denies. The problem is when that specific consensus is then used to generalize risk across all introduced species, or to imply that any questioning of management is denying the core problem.
But I'm just not convinced we can afford not to generalize without a strong precautionary stance, especially when we're dealing with these high-stakes decisions, like assessing environmental risk. How do you possibly mitigate the severe inductive risk of, waiting until irreversible harm is already done?
Inductive risk, could you elaborate slightly on that?
Yes, sure. Inductive risk, it refers to the risk of making an error when you generalize from evidence. So, for instance, wrongly accepting that a species is harmless when it's actually destructive, that's a false negative. Or conversely, wrongly rejecting a species as harmful when it's actually benign, a false positive. Now, when the potential consequences of a false negative, like, say, the extinction of a native species, are truly catastrophic, then non-epistemic values, so values outside of just pure scientific truth-seeking, they necessarily come into play in setting the burden of proof. And given the known severity of the worst invaders, the field's precautionary stance seems warranted. It effectively means non-native species are treated as, well, potentially guilty until proven innocent.
Okay, that's a compelling argument when framed in terms of minimizing potential environmental catastrophe. But I would frame the consequences of adopting that stance quite differently. That very precautionary approach, I think, leads to a systemic, almost persistent bias against all introduced species, including the many benign or even beneficial ones. There's research suggesting that somewhere between 64% and 88% of articles on introduced species frame them negatively, and that's often regardless of the actual evidence of harm presented in the paper itself.
So you're essentially saying the field has a kind of confirmation bias baked in?
I'm saying the generalization seems to be driven by, perhaps, an artificially solidified narrative. An ethical disagreement in a value-laden science like conservation isn't just necessary. I believe it's epistemically valuable precisely because it challenges those potential biases. You get diverse research programs arising from these deeper philosophical disagreements, forcing us to ask fundamental questions. Are we managing based primarily on fear of the worst-case scenario, or are we basing decisions on rigorous, unbiased assessment of the average case or the specific context?
But the fear, I'd argue, is justified when that disagreement spills out into the public sphere and starts employing rhetorical tactics that look exactly like classic science denialism. That risks real, tangible, non-epistemic harm by blocking effective policy. I mean, we've seen examples where critics, including journalists like Fred Pierce, have been accused of outright misrepresenting data, making false claims, for example, about authors withholding extinction lists, or trying to somehow frame the cane toad introduction in Australia as beneficial. This kind of thing confirms that these tactics do mislead the public, and they can draw funding and attention away from constructive conservation work, like necessary eradications.
Look, I absolutely agree that misinformation and misrepresentation are serious threats, especially to conservation funding and public support. But we also have to consider the language used by the field itself sometimes. Invasion biology often adopts these, well, frankly, militaristic metaphors. Invasion. war, combat, and sometimes rhetoric that uses words like alien and purity that carry uncomfortable echoes. Now, even if the intent isn't xenophobic, the rhetorical parallels to anti-immigrant sentiment are pretty hard to deny. And this kind of name and shame discourse, I think, can be counterproductive to achieving public buy-in and genuine scientific progress.
But surely sometimes the severity of the ecological crisis requires strong language to prompt equally strong action?
Perhaps, but studies that actually involve practitioners dealing with public dissent suggest that resistance often isn't just strict anti-science denial. Interview-based research reveals that dissent is frequently better characterized as, say, cynicism, resistance due to a perceived personal cost, like a farmer not wanting to destroy a plant they find useful or valuable. Or even nihilism, the belief that the whole endeavor is pointless or a waste of resources given the sheer scale of human impact in the Anthropocene.
Okay, but why does that distinction, cynicism versus denialism, matter practically?
It matters enormously because branding all these people as denialists simply hardens their position. It shuts down conversation. Cynicism and nihilism require entirely different communication strategies, don't they? Strategies focused maybe on shared benefits, resource allocation, finding common ground, rather than just accusing them of lying or rejecting data out of hand. The denialism label often feels like a hammer being used when really a scalpel is needed for more nuanced engagement.
Still, we cannot allow difficult discourse or these different motivations for dissent to just dismiss the empirical evidence that biogeographic origin does matter. There is ample evidence for this. Meta-analyses show, for instance, that non-native consumers, things like alien predators, often inflict significantly greater damage on prey populations than native ones do. And that's often because there's no shared evolutionary history. Critics, I find, often confuse correlation and causation here. They blurred that crucial distinction between a non-native species acting merely as a passenger, so it's benefiting from some existing disturbance, and a true invader acting as a driver, meaning it's actively causing the decline of native species. We absolutely have to prioritize stopping the drivers.
I certainly take your point that some introduced species are undeniably drivers of serious harm. Nobody disputes that. However, many other meta-analyses confirm that the impacts are incredibly variable. They're intensely context-dependent. And that variability severely hinders making the kind of broad generalizations that seem necessary to fuel that very precautionary, perhaps fear-driven narrative. Critics rightly contend, I think, that many non-native species actually increase local species richness, what ecologists call alpha diversity, and they can provide positive contributions too, maybe enhancing ecosystem services or even resilience in some cases. Shouldn't we value species more for what they do in the current environment rather than focusing so intently on where they originally came from?
But that sounds like a very selective accounting. If we only focus on increased local richness, alpha diversity, we risk completely ignoring the bigger picture, don't we? I mean, think about it. When you introduce the same handful of adaptable, cosmopolitan non-native species, you know the ones, rats, cats, pigeons, certain plants, across every corner of the globe. Yes, you might increase alpha diversity in any one specific location, but what happens globally? What happens to beta diversity? That's the variation between different locations, and gamma diversity, which is the total global diversity. You end up homogenizing the planet, and that homogenization inevitably comes at the cost of unique, locally evolved biotic resources and, frankly, global natural heritage.
And that right there is the crux of the values debate, isn't it? That continued, almost, dare I say, purist focus on historical biotic composition. Well, arguably, it's becoming increasingly obsolete in the Anthropocene. Human-altered systems, these novel ecosystems, they are increasingly the norm, not the exception. In a rapidly changing world, many native species, sadly, may no longer be well adapted to the emerging conditions anyway. Maybe we should embrace a bit more pragmatism. Recognize that the vigor and adaptability of some non-native species might actually make them essential components for maximizing overall ecological variety and resilience in our increasingly human-dominated world.
The scientific reality, though, remains that some introduced species cause absolutely devastating, sometimes irreversible harm. And that reality, I maintain, necessitates strong preventative policy, informed by the precautionary principle. Now, while rigorous debate on the underlying values is always welcome and needed, rhetoric that dismisses the overwhelming consensus on the threat posed by those high-impact invaders, well, it really must be called out and countered. We have to safeguard biodiversity and sound public policy against misleading claims.
And I'd argue the field must embrace more intellectual humility. It needs to recognize that a critique of its core conservation values, like that very strong preference for nativeness, is a legitimate philosophical challenge, not necessarily denialism. Moving forward perhaps requires replacing a kind of purist idealism with pragmatic realism, focusing management efforts more on functional integrity, on maximizing overall ecological health and resilience, rather than exclusively pursuing often unattainable historical compositions that might not even be suitable anymore for a warming, changing world.
And certainly, the ongoing tension between the scientific evidence of risk, which is real, and those underlying conservation values, which are also real and debatable, ensures this whole debate over what constitutes legitimate dissent versus harmful denialism, well, it's going to remain a critical and hopefully illuminating subject for conservation efforts worldwide for some time to come.
Indeed, and understanding why people dissent, whether it's genuinely based on different philosophies or values, or if it stems from actual misinformation or perceived costs, that understanding is surely key to managing our very complex and rapidly transforming relationship with the natural world around us.